Apple Island is a small island off the coast of Oak Island, and it features a long extending pier-like sandbar that almost looks like a key from above. Beyond the dreams I mentioned in the beginning, there were other photographers and authors speaking about the Bedford Barrens that link back to Apple that I thought were interesting to check out. I've now landed on Apple Island. There's my little kayak. It's quite windy today. Pretty cloudy. But I am standing on the causeway with a little, little tail at the end. So I'm gonna walk out just a little bit further. So you can see it's pretty big, pretty far out here. From here, then we turn around, boom, there's Oak Island. When I first landed on Apple Island, I discovered all sorts of carvings on various rocks and larger boulders. Some symbols I cannot identify, but they appear to be early Hebrew. This arrow. We also found a shepherd staff carving. There's people who've noticed a goat's head. Another symbol I believe to be early Hebrew for doorway. This triangle with the 3 dots I thought was interesting, as well as a G with an underline. This is on Apple, I thought represented Ursa Major and Ursa Minor in crude symbol form, as well as this stone with circle carvings. On Clay Island, I also found another representation for Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, with an eye carved into this rock and an eye carved out of the rock for the double meaning for above and below. Near the water's edge on Apple Island, I came across a really interesting carving that I think deserves a closer look. What I believe to be a King's Mark Grail stone carving, simply because of the chalice and the T connecting joins the masculine and feminine symbols with what I believe is a lamed symbol for heart, as well as sitting on top of a Grail representation of a cup. The line weight throughout the carving tells to me that this is an on-purpose mark and not just a weathering mark. So you can see I've outlined the inner symbol to the outer symbol that I believe is a lamed symbol that represents the teaching through the heart, as well as being the 12th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, also symbolizing the 12 disciples of Jesus. An instruction through the heart, its action through the heart. And something to keep in mind later as we go into the Tree of Life more is that lamed, the 12th, connects the beauty and the strength. So as we continue our way through the Tree of Life, please keep that in mind. Just a little while ago, I showed that Bedford Baron symbol. Um, what was interesting about that is my feelings that Apple Island was represented on that, and it actually had a notch right here. So in the center of Apple, there's a clearing in between rose bushes. There's two different rose bushes. There's one in the center and then one in the outer. When I first found it, that featured a white headstone, then 7 stones off to the side. And one of the other reasons why I was there in the first place was because of other authors and their research on the Pleiades and how that aligns around the world. So on Apple, in that center circle where that secondary rose bush is, that first cut my leg, that featured the white headstone, is this carving I found next to 2 stones. So I found a spear and I found this stone. And this stone I found a carving of a sailboat on the side with some form of writing below it that I can't really make out, but I know they're trying to be letter forms. While walking through the center rose bushes, I cut my leg, which forced me to look down. This is where I found the spear tucked halfway into the dirt. The spear is roughly 7.75 inches long by 5 inches wide and weighs roughly 2.6 pounds. There are many indications of man-made carvings, the pointed tip, and the curved sides, as well as markings where straps would have been to hold the spear in place on the once rod. After arriving home, I observed the spear, and on the bottom was a very flat but very smooth section where I instantly noticed the hooked X. What I saw that surprised me was the dots around the hooked X didn't appear to be random marks. They were all consistently the same size, the same technique to make punch marks. But what I instantly saw in the top right portion of the hooked X was Orion's belt, and on the very diagonal corner I saw a cross similar to the Crux constellation as well as Nolan's cross that is represented on Oak Island, just off the shore of Apple Island. And the hook X has been around and has been seen all throughout New England and further into Minnesota and other parts of America, as well as Portugal, Scotland, France. Anywhere the Templars have been, there have left this mark within runes as a symbol. What was interesting to this was that it was telling a much bigger story than just a simple hooked X. I identified Orion's belt and then positioned it with the crux so that we were able to make it. And what transformed was the story of the Holy Grail and the X symbol itself. By simply connecting the dots, I was able to figure out that the other 2 arms both linked to Crater constellation and, I'm not saying this right, but hologram, the left sign that points to Fornax. So what we're having here is the top upmost corner is Orion, the hooked X represents Canis Major or Sirius, and then the bottom left is Crux. So they are telling a story within the hooked X symbol that is much deeper. So going back through research and time, we found that Orion represents the hunter, the father. Sirius represents the mother or Isis. The cross represents that crucified child, the Savior child, the Messiah child, that's represented by the perfect union. While connecting the 2 are the Crater and Fornax, both represented as a Holy Grail and as the furnace or the ark. It was almost like the 2 sides were meeting in the middle. The side of Christianity represented by the Grail and Crater, and the side of Judaism, fornext, the Ark of the Covenant, joining in the center between this period of Jesus Christ's work, both the Old Testament and the New Testament coming together in the center, surrounded by the Holy Family. In just a moment, we'll take a deeper dive into Argo Navis, where everything meets up in the center, and talk about the layers. But I quickly wanted to talk about where the symbol, in my opinion, originates out of Egypt, originally represented by the crook and flail, which kings used to rule, and as a symbol that they should rule between mercy and severity, that they should never be fully one or the other, but there's perfect balance between all. Many of the Freemasons designs that we see today are represented between two pillars. This is partially what these two pillars mean, to balance between mercy and severity, to find that perfect center. And conveniently, it was Freemason astronomers that had identified parts of Argo Navis and later the subsequent breaking up into smaller constellations, as well as identifying the more than 100 stars. Argo Navis has a rich history beyond just Jason and the Argonauts, as older mythology states that this was the vessel that Osiris used to float down the Nile River and barge between this world and the underworld. And some even argue that Argo goes back even further to Sumerian times, when during the Epic of Gilgamesh it was used as the primary vessel in that legend and that archetype of Noah's Ark. I really thought it was interesting the sheer number of layers within this hooked X mark, and the center of itself has its own depth between generations, from Sumerians to Osiris to Judaism and Noah's Ark to the Christianity stories and to the modern times where, on Oak Island itself, there is a giant cross made out of boulders, and slowly there have been ship parts pulled out of the swamp and the surrounding areas, where there is fabled to be a capsized old Spanish galleon that was used to bring over, potentially the Ark of the Covenant. And so we're getting this build-up of the story, this repetition of the archetype. And the fleece itself has so many similar symbols to the Holy Grail quest itself, in all the layers. So please feel free to research the Golden Fleece and Jason itself, and how close Jason, a representation of the solar god, just like Jesus, and how they parallel. Later, we will take a much deeper dive into this constellation group between Crux, Argo, Orion, and beyond, to see how this all plays out, because this group of constellations has played out all over the world in all sorts of religions and spiritual practices. Getting back to the spear itself, on the backside it is checkered with small little bits of yellow, or this gold reflective color, that brought my attention to the tip. After examining the hooked X on the bottom, I was curious to explore the rest of it. Getting a magnifying glass, I was looking closely at the tip and noticed this one particular speck of gold color that drew my eye closer. And as I moved the magnifying glass around, an image popped out and I dropped to my knees. It was the woman I saw earlier in my dream, kayaking around small islands looking for something. The gold speck that drew my eye was now her heart glowing as the Grail. Above her, Jesus on the cross, and above him, a face peering in. Seeing the representation of someone who I had seen in my own dreams only 6 months prior was blowing my mind. As my eyes settled and I adjusted, more of the image became clear, and all the beings around them started to pop out. This was the representation of Jesus' last day while on the cross, and everybody surrounding him. Using Photoshop, for this example, I darkened out everything else that wasn't Mary, Jesus, or the face above them. You can obviously see Mary's hair parted, her cheeks. You can see Jesus' face, his mustache, his dreadlocks, the crown above him, and his arms directly horizontal. On Jesus' left shoulder are 2 birds, one a raven and one a dove. Above Jesus, I clearly saw another face, horizontal, enclosed in a capsule or a force field as it looks. Almost as if there was another being peering in from another dimension. In the upper right-hand corner of the face, or the left-hand side of the brain if you are the face, there is a representation of a perfect cube similar to that of the Kaaba cube in Mecca. Pulling back, you can see the full picture. The far right is the charcoal drawing that I did of the full image after the fact that I saw it, putting the whole thing together, pulling all the parts out that I could. To the left of the Grail image, you'll see a being pointing to its mouth with its right hand, while its left hand points down to a group of stones and a girl that looks like she's praying. So while zooming back to see the full picture, we see a wide range of beings that look like they're here on Earth, but also deep within the universe, peering in during this one event of the crucifixion of the Christ. There is dual symbolism going on around the image, as we'll see in the next part where we explore the gesture and the being pointing to his mouth and some of the symbols used within that. So as I mentioned earlier, to the left of the Grail family, Mary, Jesus, and the face above, there is a being pointing to its mouth using its right hand at the same angle where many representations of Harpocrates has been represented. Now initially I did not know what this figure meant, but I definitely saw the figure. And as I dug more into Harpocrates, I realized, this symbol has been around since the very beginning. and always, and almost always, represented near the Divine Mother or its mother figure. The groupings between Harpocrates and Isis, represent this bond, and we see it once again in the Grail stone itself, as the figure is just off to the side slightly of Mary and Jesus. The figure also comes together with the left foot facing forward in many representations, and doing research into this symbol, it is supposed to represent, since the heart is on the left side of the body, that the young king, the ruler, would learn to rule through the heart itself. Many of these representations of the gesture pointing to its mouth are surrounded also by the 7 stars of the Pleiades, as we saw before, where this all lines up with. The gesture itself has been used by many different groups, ranging from secrecy to the early version in Egypt, which was used to represent a child, because children running around in the court often had to be told to be quiet. What I found interesting was Harpocrates was also being represented as the Alpha and the Omega, the sun of the universe, with the symbolisms of the Ouroboros, the 7 stars, the side lock, which was often used to represent the eternal child or the initiate, almost as the next Christ figure, the next solar sun part of this archetype. And this right here is my favorite example of Isis's wings surrounding Harpocrates. What I didn't expect was the sheer amount of symbolism that this symbol shared with different spiritual practices around the world. We saw it represented with Krishna, while his other hand is in the milk pot, the honey pot, that was used as one of the Grail representations given to him by a mother figure. Harpocrates has also been found in the Dendera zodiac in Egypt, where it is connected to Libra, and on that sign, the figure is pointing to its mouth, encapsulated in a circle, representing the scales of balance. Libra fits into that greater constellation group that we showed earlier of Sirius, Orion, Taurus, and the Pleiades. Libra connects in at the bottom next to Virgo and points to Ursa Major and the pole star. And I found it very interesting that Harpocrates shares symbolism also with the rose, and we'll talk about that much more in detail at the end. But as I said in the beginning, that this all started by being cut by the rose thorn, that I reached in and found the spear underneath the rose. So it's extremely poetic that Harpocrates, whose symbolism is silence, and the rose, could be found sub rosa, or underneath the rose. A moment ago, while discussing Argo, we drew that line from Argo to Sirius, Orion, and the Pleiades, and we showed it in multiple forms. Now, with adding Harpocrates, which symbolism represents Libra, we can continue that line one step further, where Libra connects through and is actually pointing to the pole star, Ursa Major and Minor, continuing on through to Argo, Sirius, Orion, Pleiades. And we're going to talk about that much detail and what that means to Oak Island and Freemasons and the Knights Templar, and how that connects back around to the dual meaning of arc that we've been using. And right here we are just showing the multiple uses that Ursa Major and the pole star has been represented through the different spiritual practices around the world, and how the mythology around the bear has continued. As I'm I'm sure you have noticed from the charcoal drawing and even the rock carving, as some of the figures around the Holy Family start to pop out, is the UFO that is not only just peering over Golgotha, but you can actually see the driver within the vessel coming out through the Pleiades, the 7 stars, down to Earth. This is not just a singular representation, that once you dive into art history and carvings around the world, you see this representation around religious figures actually quite often, as it turns out, that either they're peering in from another dimension or they're being represented near the crucifixion. When I looked closely at the carving, I could clearly see a white dove framing Jesus' face, as well as the inverse raven fitting nicely into that dove on Jesus' left shoulder. The 2 birds carry a ton of symbolism within world religions and could talk, make a whole presentation alone on them. The yin and yang of the raven and the dove represented on Jesus' left shoulder, the heart side, represent the life and death cycle. Going back to the spear, above the flat surface where the hook X resides is this symbol that I clearly saw was an A connected by an O bottom, as I have studied typography and design within my own major. So the symbol itself was fairly obvious to me, not only because of the carving out of the rock, but because of the red substance that was sitting on top of it that actually has a noticeable chip mark out of it. The A and the O come to represent the Alpha and the Omega, the representation of the beginning and the end, and the Christ figure itself. Many archetypal Christ figures have used this phrase, I am the beginning and the end, the first and the last. In this representation, the A and the O also represents gold and alchemy, which is what is said to be buried in Oak Island because of the tablet. When I got a microscope and zoomed in on the red paint or red blood that is placed on top of the Alpha and the Omega symbol, I saw this triangle with a dot in the center, and I remembered from seeing a TV show about the tomb of Jesus, where it was alleged that Jesus was buried in a tomb with that symbol. Doing further explorations around the spear, I noticed this triangle in the corner that mirrors the same patterns around Oak Island and Apple Island on Birch Island, as well as the Roman numerals MCX with a notch within the C in order to show that this was an on-purpose writing of the letters MCX. By doing further research into that, I discovered that MCX equals the year 1110. What I didn't know while doing that research was the doors that this number would open within Freemason and Templar symbology. First representing the 3 nails going into Jesus while he's in the cross, 1 through each hand and 1 through the foot, as well as the crown that was placed upon his head. We get a nail, and a crown, all adding up in Gamatia, which is a mathematical numerology code that the Templars and Freemasons and others have used to disguise words within numbers. Conveniently, the sign that was placed above Jesus while he was being crucified was the King of the Jews, which in Gamatia equals 1110. What follows is all of the words I was able to find within this spectrum, and we're going to come back to some later as we get into some of the real Oak Island and how this relates to it. But as you will see, the secret arc door equals 1110 as well, that is being talked about on this spear. While exploring the spear some more with my magnifying glass, I came across this interesting carving I thought represented the all-seeing eye. Knowing that these triangle shapes could not be natural, as well as the circle-oval shape at the top, I decided to look closer. While looking closer, there were two repeating triangles on top of each other, as well as this oval shape. But as I looked closer, it wasn't an oval. It was almost like it was a snake and a tail's head coming together, as well as this language I could see that was trying to write out. I've made this graphic representation and then found this graphical representation within a Freemason book of an Italian Freemason. The symbolism goes way beyond just one level, as both the triangle represented for perfection and God's word, as well as being at the bottom of Enoch's pit made out of solid gold, but the Ouroboros on top made a brand new symbol. We could spend a whole presentation just speaking about the symbols within the Ouroboros, but the self-sufficiency creation that fuels itself into creation and has no beginning or has no end, but just is, being represented on the spear was incredible. Some even say that the Ouroboros, in combination as the capstone to the pyramid, is referring to the great work, or the work that Jesus spoke about while being on the cross when he yelled out, "It is finished." You know, the completion of that cycle as it was building towards something. And here we are again in this generation, many believing that there is going to be a second coming or the continuing of the cycle. But within the cycle and the symbol itself, there is no beginning or there is no end. The great work continues across time and space. We are now going to start putting together all the pieces that we have talked about: the Alpha, the Omega, the Grail symbol, the Ouroboros capstone, the Grail family, the Lamed symbol on Apple Island, the Grail symbol we saw there, and how they all connect together. I even showed you earlier how the points around the hooked X represent the Holy Family itself, and even the drawing of the Grail, Mary, Jesus, Harpocrates, all represent the constellations themselves. What we're now going to talk about is how they relate back to Oak Island through the cross that has been discovered by Fred Nolan and the Tree of Life that the Templars have laid out there as the New Jerusalem. When I zoomed into the cross at the bottom of the hooked X, there was one point that has a small line going through it, starting in the left corner and then going into the center. You'll see a line that goes through. I interpret this as the path into the treasure vault, whatever is left behind. In this view, you can clearly see that there is an X marks the spot and several dots leading up to it. I believe this is the path into the heart of the cross. The path also relates to the Pythagorean triangle, which once again fits into the numerology that the Templars and Masons loved within their system, but also how the rest of the cross is built out into this triangle of repeating patterns. Freemasons and others have used this as a symbol for a long time, as it is one of the earliest mathematical formulas for building and construction and units of measurements when you're able to just use one triangle to do a lot of other things. What I also discovered is that once you lay Jesus over the Nolan's cross dots on the spear, you also take the same path into the treasure vault as the spear would have traveled into Jesus' own heart while he was on the cross. And remember, they did this in order to check if Jesus was dead yet. That they had argued not to break his legs, that they should poke him with the spear to see if that was enough. When Jesus was poked, he bled both blood and water. And doing further research, this can only happen with one organ, and that is your heart. There is a thin sac around the heart made out of a water protective, so this would have been blood and water, both bleeding out of his heart. Going even further, lining Jesus' crucifixion up with the Tree of Life, you find that the spot represents Dath, or hidden knowledge, between the veil of the upper and the lower. Rosicrucians have also depicted this as the opening to their cross, as well as between the two pillars of mercy and severity, as we had talked about earlier, which was used in Solomon's temple as you walked into the inner room, the Ark room, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Freemasons and even Francis Bacon have used these two pillars throughout time to represent this same path between mercy and severity on the Tree of Life, represented by the male and female, and even while Jesus was on the cross, represented between the two thieves. The moment that Jesus was crucified, there was a dark storm, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. This would have represented the veil into the inner room where the ark was being kept. Jesus' death had resulted in that closeness, the proximity to the inner being torn in two. There were no guards anymore keeping you from that inner room. Anyone freely at that moment could have been seen right into the inner room as the rock and the veil were split. Back on Oak Island, every June 21st, or summer solstice, the constellation Cygnus, which is represented as another cross, and even Nolan's cross on Oak Island, was originally found with the Deneb stone, the top stone, slightly off center. It wasn't perfectly straight across, it was slightly off to the center, more in pairing with Cygnus. Every June 21st or summer solstice, Cygnus is directly above Nolan's cross, 1-to-1, on the most holiest day for the Templars. There's 2 solstice points, either December 25th or June 21st. These were 2 very important dates between the Templars, Rosicrucians, and others, as they all followed the same as above, so below principles, that what was created on earth has ripples in heavens, and the heavens thus have ripples on earth, and the 2 are one. So Cygnus, at its peak, is right above, locked in with Nolan's cross during the Cancer strength of the longest day of summer, represented by the keystone in the Freemason Royal Arch degree. And as you can see, the keystone is what keeps up the rest of the arch together, the arch or the arc. So we have recreated everything that we have talked about in its various levels. So on the hooked X itself, we found the stars around it. We also discovered that the stars around it, Libra, Virgo, Leo, Orion, the Pleiades, all represent this holy royal arch degree within Freemasonry. And it's really interesting that this arch represents the doorway into the Ark of the Covenant, where the story goes that these boys found the Ark of the Covenant, and when bringing it back to their Freemason leader, they're asked the question, how did you do such a thing? And their response was, well, not through might, nor by power, but by my spirit. And I found that very fitting, as my own journey started through dreams and meditation, and then the research following up on that, and connecting these dots, and really taking the action to believe in them, to drive the 12 hours out to Nova Scotia, put my kayak in, and go out to Apple Island on a whim. All the symbols on the spear, and even the spear being on apple next to oak, almost as if it was the keystone set aside by the builders. You know, when you leave a key under your mat to get back into the house, to the inner room, where the last treasures of the Templars resides, within the heart of the cross. For where your treasure is where your heart is. Matthew 6:21. 6:21 also being the solstice date, the longest day of the year, the solar god, that archway into the inner room, where the Holy Arch meets in the center, the keystone that holds it all together. The sheer amount of symbolism layered up on top of each other, from the hooked X telling the story of the Grail family to the actual image of the Grail family found on the tip, above and below the spear. The Templars, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, everything was poetry. It wasn't just, building a building. It was using art. It was being beautiful. It was bringing out the creative ability within the human soul. Something I had found very interesting after the fact of the initial research was this interview in which Jane Blankenship, wife of Dan Blankenship, had a dream in which she was told that Dan would find something to do with the Virgin Mary. And while I tried during the last couple years of Dan's life to reach to him to show him my work, that was stopped at the gate. I had very much wished to show Dan my work, for he had put a lifetime into it, as well as Fred Nolan, but both had passed before I got a chance to talk to them. This place and time in which we exist in has had many experiences and stories and mythology of goddesses and apples and roses. These are some of the most major symbols within most religions. Apple even meaning Yanzafalian, or Isle of Avalon, the place where King Arthur would rest finally. In Norse mythology, many came to Bridget, or Brigid, however you want to pronounce it, for her immortal apples that gave warriors strength, in her cauldron of immortality that never ran out. Idun, or even Idun, as it is, also played a role in Norse mythology. The apple itself has been a symbol, it seems like, as soon as we could get symbols, the Garden of Eden itself, the place where Eve first ate the apple off the tree and then gave it to Adam. And while Jesus was on the cross, he yelled out, "The work is finished, it is done." In his mind, making up for the faults of Adam or others. And even in popular culture today, in the Da Vinci Code, where Tom Hanks runs around looking for the Holy Grail, they're continually finding apple symbolisms throughout this, even under the rose, sub rosa. Our most famous scientists, have tested experiences through apples. The biggest computer company in the world right now is Apple Computers. This isn't mistake, this is symbolism that is deep ingrained into our subconscious, just as the rose is with love. As well as the Rosicrucians, whose name derives from the rose cross. Which is interesting because, as we talked about earlier, Cygnus the Cross is right above Oak Island, and Oak Island has connections with Francis Bacon. And hidden within the works of Shakespeare, as researchers have made the connection between Francis Bacon and Shakespeare. Even Roslyn Chapel, which gets its name from the rose, as well as the rose line it sits on, has adorned its ceilings covered in roses, with a keystone above one of the archways, pointing down to an X on the floor with the Sinclair shield, with the Sinclairs being the ones rumored to have made the voyage from Scotland, Roslyn Chapel, to Nova Scotia meaning New Scotland. The Rosicrucians always believed that they were a traveling college, that they had no location or no order, that it was made up of individuals who would find their way amongst the path of the rose. And even in the world of the Rosicrucians, we find the symbol repeated of the rose and the cross, and in the work, their manuscripts itself, we see the sign of silence pointing inverse, even standing on a perfect cube with silence written on it. I find this next part interesting, the thorn in the flesh, making it possible to overcome obstacles to the prize of God. As I myself had cut my own leg while reaching for the spear. The Phoenix and the Grail, a lodge within the Rosicrucian organizations, jumped out to me, as from my meditation I had seen a phoenix rise out of the Grail before going to Oak Island. I fully believe that the Templars, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, whatever you want to call them, left Scotland, reaching out to the New World to establish their New Jerusalem after leaving Europe and the Middle East on Friday the 13th, and then moving up to Scotland and across to Nova Scotia, where they would call home, and reaching out into America, where they would establish boundaries with the Kensington Runestone, the Newport Tower, and Oak Island, this triangle setup would be their boundaries for their new world, Jerusalem, that they looked to establish a place of peace and religious freedom away from the Pope, away from the King of France, who had become corrupted, away from everything that they were escaping in order to set out on a new age of enlightenment. And if you look at the way that America was set up, you'll discover that our principles, life, liberty, and freedom, religious freedom, and freedom of speech were all necessary in order for the Templars to create a new foundation, a new hope, that one where the Pope could not control your thought, control everything about it. And here we are today, in the age of the Aquarius, represented by the golden chalice, and previously Jesus occupying the Piscean age, represented by fish and water, and before him Moses and Abraham, represented in the age of Aries, and the use of the ram symbol. You know, these symbols are repeated throughout time in different places all over the world in order to get the human subconscious to rise up, to question, to think, to be more humane to each other, to be more loving through the heart. You know, this whole thing started after my dad passed away, and it was hard to get out of bed. And I had these dreams of this blonde woman coming to sit next to me, who would rub my hair and put her hand on my heart, my soul, and refill it with love. And 3 months later, I saw her below Jesus with the Grail beaming out of her own heart that represented the compassionate love for all living creatures.